Hi everyone, welcome to this brand new interview on doing sociology. We're extremely happy to have with us today Professor Pushpesh Kumar, who teaches sociology at the University of Hyderabad. And he will be talking to us today on his research on sexuality studies, a subject which is extremely interesting, but at the same time under research in India. So before we begin with the interview, I'd like to tell you all a little bit about him. In terms of his present academic concerns, he studies queer movements, queer pedagogy, religion and queer issues. He also looks at Marxism and queer theory and alternative families and kinship. He has published extensively in leading national and international journals on gender and sexuality and on pedagogical issues. He was invited to the South Asia Center, Syracuse University, to share his views on queering Indian sociology in 2017. He has been a visiting fellow at the Department of Anthropology at the London School of Economics, at the Department of Sociology, Delhi School of Economics, as well as the Center for the Study of Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He received the M.N. Srinivas Memorial Prize for Young Sociologist in 2007 for his paper, Gender and Procreative Ideology Among the Kollams of Maharashtra. This was published in Contributions to Indian Sociology. He has also contributed to the EPW special volume on women and feminism in India in 2015. And his forthcoming edited volume from Routledge is called Sexuality, Abjection and Queer Existence in Contemporary India. Welcome, sir. Extremely glad to have you with us today.
Yeah. So, sir, since you've been working on something...
Just tell me, just call me Pushpesh. No, sir, please.
Okay. So, since you've been working on something like sexuality, which interests a lot of new students now, which is also interdisciplinary, could you start with talking a little bit about the history of the study of sexuality in Indian sociology?
Yeah, sure. So, I think in my understanding, sociology and social anthropology in India, their overlapping and interacting disciplinary practices have not taken sexuality very seriously, and they remain by and large sanitized and normativized discourses, ignoring the question of desire and erotic marginalities. They have to accept that desire and body are socially regulated and controlled, and micro and macro socio-political, economic, and cultural processes do mediate how we experience freedom, sexual agency as erotic subjects, or how violence and oppression threaten and curb our sexual self and sexual freedom. Given this lack and absence of uh, sexuality studies in sociology, Indian sociology particularly, I must confess that sexuality as a sociological issue does intermittently configure and surface mostly in certain feminist social anthropological writings, even when sexuality is not the exclusive concern of these writings. I will focus on certain thinkers and particular writings towards this claim, though not in a strict chronological order. So first of all, I go back to 1955 and I just refer to Kathleen Gough. Kathleen Gough's 1955 prize-winning essay, Female Initiation Rite in Malabar Coast, where she talks about Nayars of South and North Malabar District, Tiyas of North Malabar District, and Tiyas of South Malabar and Cochin. Through rich ethnography and analysis, she demonstrates how puberty rituals contribute in sexing and gendering the body. Fearing incest in matrilineal context, for example, the avoidance between senior male and the woman is symbolically instituted, the menstruating woman. The woman on the puberty ritual. I mentioned here again how these work were further carried out by Karin Kapadia in the context of rural Tamil Nadu in her book Siva and Her Sisters. Coming much later in 1980s, where Kapadia elaborates on menstrual taboo, puberty rituals, and construction of feminine subject across caste and classes in rural Tamil Nadu. One can, so if you look at these cultures where puberty is such a concern, an over concern rather, and you know, this very private bodily affair becomes a very public issue, right? The whole communitarian concern, in fact. So I'm just trying to ask this question. One can think here of trans men and lesbian women, bisexual, asexual, and other genders and sexualities in a society where fecundity of female body is celebrated and exaggerated through rites and rituals. What will happen to, what psychic damage it can do to such constituencies, such gender non-conforming and sexual non-conforming entities in such cultures? For many of the ideological or many of the children who are assigned feminine gender at birth, for example, but who wish to take cross-gender identity, and they may be homoerotic or asexual. What kind of psychic damage the puberty ritual can do to them, as is expressed by many trans men. So many trans men who have been who have been assigned female at birth, but they want to become men, and they have been expressing that puberty ritual and menstruation is the time which is the most horrific time in their life cycle, or in their life particularly. So if a culture where there is so much of over concern on puberty, the fecundity of feminine body, what will happen to different non-conforming genders and sexuality if they are assigned female at birth particularly? Then I talk about from Kathleen Gough and Karin Kapadia, I come to work of Leela Dubey. Leela Dubey makes a very significant contribution in gender intensive field, and she did think about feminine body and sexuality. I wish to mention her seminal essay, Seed and Earth, the symbolism of biological reproduction and sexual relation of production. The essay appearing in 1986. Dubey is very nuanced. She does a very nuanced and deeper analysis, and she deals with cultural symbolism of biological reproduction, where a woman's body is treated as earth and male contribution implied sowing seeds. It translates into ownership of productive resources, land and children to men, and also control over body and sexuality of women. She writes that those who sows the seeds also own the field and also the fruits, and the fruits are children. Dubey argues how this symbolism has a paralegal force. Within kinship studies, you can then see Rajni Palriwala and Carla Russo's edited volume, Shifting Circle of Support, contextualizing kinship and gender in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Several essays in this volume talk about control and regulation of female sexuality through kinship norms and through changes which are instituted through colonial intervention. The legacy of such work is further visible, in Janki Abraham and Anuja Agarwal's contributions, which are more recent, I think. Anuja's work on Bedia's familial prostitution, where economy of community is based on prostitution of sisters and daughters, and not the wife and daughter-in-law. Janki Abraham's work on Tia women in North Kerala and their sexual liaison with white men in colonial times, and how this white connection became stained and how these women's families were excommunicated in revealing the white connection. This is also a very revealing essay. I then mentioned Patricia Oberoy's, her book, Social Reform, Sexuality and State, which speaks for itself. But I choose two essays in this book, which are by sociologists. One is by Sarmila Rege's Hegemonic Appropriation of Sexuality, the case of Labni Performer, and another by Patricia herself, When is a Marriage Not a Marriage? Sarmila Rege articulated the historically institutionalized appropriation of sexual labor, the stigmatization and marginalization of Dalit women belonging to certain communities, and she talks about Kolhati women. Kolhati is a nomadic tribe community but they were part of what Sharmila Rege calls the Balutedari system, or the patron-client relationship in that particular caste economy. So in popular imagination, these women, as they perform a dance form which is called Lavani, which is also called Sringarik Lavani. The Sringarik or erotic became one of the modes of constructing the bodies of these lower caste women as either constantly arousing or satiating male desire. Patricia looks at the subtext of judicial decisions pertaining to divorce and marital disputes in Indian courts, and she demonstrates how judicial pontification deploys a theory of sexuality soaked in both Western and local patriarchies. And even the judges try to help out the woman who is bringing the marital dispute, or trying to take divorce. The judges do more harm to these women than help, because they always bring a theory of sexuality to interpret, understand, and pass judgment, which are always soaked in both Western and local patriarchal understanding of women's bodies and women's sexualities and marriage. I cannot forget to mention then Kalpana Kannabiran's writings, mostly focusing on law and gendered violence, but have always talked about body and sexuality. Maitri Chaudhary's later work, and I specifically mention gender, media, and popular culture in global India, she does bring in issue of desire, body, sexuality in nuanced ways in globalizing and corporatized India. Having said these, I must tell that all such discussion of body, desire, sexuality, sexual politics in various contexts were confined in binary of male and female. Besides desire, body's desire, sexuality beyond this binary remained tabooed. I solely credit Sanjay Srivastava for broadening the horizon of sociological debates on sexuality by highlighting the heterosexualization of Indian modernity. Through interpellated domains of colonialism, social reform, and nationalist politics, by also foregrounding the question of class. I recommend his essay entitled The Idea of Lata Mangeshkar, Hindu Sexuality, the Girl Child, and Heterosexual Desire in Times of Five-Year Plan. I also refer to my own working paper in 2013 from Center for Studies of Social System, JNU, called Queering Indian Sociology, which for the first time proposes a queering of Indian sociology. I was happy to see that many people refer to it in their writings. My writings on Kothi, and then I have also worked on queer Muslims and their negotiation with the sexual self and religious self, and some other more writings. I think they may not be well circulated, but they talk about subordinate masculinities in a heteropatriarchal system. I also refer to Niharika Banerjee's work on lesbian feminism, and I must acknowledge that though I haven't read it, in diasporic context, then the people who are practicing sociology and social anthropology, I must acknowledge Gayatri Reddy's work with respect to sex, and writings of Naisargi Dave, queer activism in India, and works of Rohit Das Gupta. So this is the whole journey of sexuality. This is how I try to map out the sexualities, the focus on sexuality within Indian sociology, which is less, but it is there. Yeah.
Thank you, Pushpesh. I think you've elaborately put the sexuality studies in Indian sociology. My question to you pertains to your work. You mentioned that sexuality is an important, if not more than any other aspect of social life, and that it does connect to the socioeconomic, cultural, and political phenomenon in complex ways in a given time and context. Can you tell us a little more about this?
Definitely, they're connected. These issues are connected. Sexuality is not something which is isolated. Otherwise, it would not become the subject of sociology itself. Sex has a history. Sex is not ahistorical. Sex connects to social, economic, cultural, and political phenomena. Let me illustrate through the recent death of Anjana Haris from Kerala, a young 21-year-old bisexual person. If it is a suicide, why her bisexuality becomes consequential for her, causing her death? If it is sexuality is in isolation and she is an individual, she need not commit suicide because of her bisexuality. Her tortuous journey starts with a revelation of her bisexuality to her family, as the media reports reveal. What is the support system available to such persons even in post 377 times when the homosexuality is legalized and section 377, the draconian law has been read down? Corporeal punishment apart, her family left no stone unturned to subject her to conversion therapy. How does a heteronormative family and community or neighborhood make sense to such person? So sexuality is not something which is an isolated phenomena. It is mediated by family. It is mediated by community. I give you another example of what happens to transgender women sex workers during COVID-19 and during the lockdown. As sex work is unavailable, most of them are on verge of collapse and financially broken. While the poor migrants have home to go back to, transgender women mostly have no home to go back to. This is the consequences of their gender non-conformity. But if you are privileged and queer, right, in class terms, if you are privileged and cis-normative, because transgender sex workers are also cross-dressing, they're hyper-visible, their bodies are hyper-visible, their sexualities are hyper-visible. But if you are a cis-normative, gay, and lesbian, and also affluent, your corporate jobs keeps you safe and going even in the crisis situation. So, you know, the socio-economic, the cultural, the political, all these connects to sexuality. That would be my answer.
Okay. Could you also talk about the role that the state plays in constructing ideas of sexuality, and if these ideas change with the changing nature of the state itself?
Yeah, true. I think state is a major actor in instituting sexual democracy. For example, if I give you an example, by making public spaces safe for women, who will make public spaces safe for women? Not the individual men, not the individual men and women, or not anyone else, but it is the responsibility of the state to make public spaces safe for women. And this was the debate post Nirvaya. After this Nirvaya thing happened, and women were walking in the nights, claiming the nights, etc. So who will make it possible for women to walk in the night freely as any male citizen would walk? For example, which there's a book called Foil Loiter, and Silpa Phadke is talking about claiming the night. So when the patriarchy will be overturned, when sexual democracy will be ensured or instituted, when women have freedom to walk in the night. And who will make it possible? The state has a major responsibility and the state has a bigger role to play. So this is one example. Through socioeconomic entitlements to transgender community, because transgender community is not only a gender and sexuality, they are also a socioeconomic category. They are very poor. So who will make possible the socioeconomic entitlement to these transgender communities? It is the responsibility of state. So considering the demands of intersex collectives and changing the medical practices around intersexuality. So intersex people are the most invisible entities within LGBTQI communities, right? So the moment an intersex child is born, it is taken to the medical professional or a medical doctor. The medical doctor looks at the external genitalia of the child and tries to convert the child into a male or female. The child is not allowed to become which gender they want to take. The intersex people can grow up as men, male, female, and transgender. To allow that child, and there are a lot of medical procedures involved in dealing with the intersex children's body. And the medical establishment and the medical science has to be sensible to the needs of intersex people to ensure sexual democracy, right? But who will do that? It is the responsibility of the state to change or make certain shifts in the medical practices around intersexuality. Funding Women Study Center. You will see that women study centers are always in crisis, but women study centers has contributed towards gender and sexual democracy. But if the funding is weakening, the centers will weaken. But who will fund them? Not the corporate. If the corporate funding is accepted by the Women Study Center, the corporate will have its own agenda. So state can nurture women study centers and ensure sexual democracy. Um, and judiciously and honestly spending Nirvaya Fund. You know that Nirvaya Fund was created to make public spaces safe for women. If public spaces would have been safe for women, the thing what happened in Hyderabad, the rape of this veterinary doctor, would not have had happened, right? So, so how to judiciously spend Nirvaya Fund? Some 35% or 20% of the fund is only spent. The major chunk of the fund remains unspent. So how the public spaces will be safe? And who has this responsibility? It is the state who has the responsibility. I have mentioned Suparna Bhaskaran's book, Made in India, and where she talks about the intensifying heterosexualization in post-1990s through spectacularization of beauty pageant and cricket star masculinity. So the beauty pageants and cricket star masculinity, the femininity which is very motherly but which is also very individualistic and transnational, right? But also very native, right? All these are combined and played out within the embodiment of beauty queen, the cultural ambassadors of India. So state is conniving with and collaborating with transnational capital, market, and media in a scripting this heterosexualization, while engaging uh, with the queer people or queer subjects through HIV/AIDS program. So I'm asking this question: state is proud of beauty queens and cricket star, but never find lesbian subjects being visible during Fire cinema controversy, and lesbians are coming out as as a collective. So state is not even ready to acknowledge that lesbian women are a collective in India, and they are also Indian citizens. But state is collaborating with transnational capital, media, and market in instituting a kind of heterosexualization. So state has a responsibility. State has to reflect upon its own modus operandi if it wants to ensure sexual democracy in India. I would say that if state turns non-discriminatory towards sexual and gender non-conforming persons by instituting or introducing, for example, gender-neutral washroom in public spaces, who will institute gender-neutral washrooms in public spaces? It is the state who can do it. So democracy might begin to take shape by incorporating gender non-conformity in school curricula or incorporating diversity of bodies in school biology textbooks. State can institute sexual democracy. So state has a big responsibility on it. Yeah.
Right.
Thank
So
you.
you also talk about something called sexual citizenship. So what is your take on sexual citizenship in India at the moment?
I think sexual citizenship is not only redoing sexuality, reworking sexuality, but also by legitimizing formal equality to genders and sexualities and also empowering women particularly. But it also requires redoing economy in the sense of socio-economic entitlement, ensuring socio-economic entitlement. For example, transgender people have been given extended rights. Working class gay and lesbian has been extended rights. But the working class lesbian, if you read Maya Sharma, their life is so much integrated into community. They don't know even the word lesbian, right? So if they don't have socio-economic entitlements, how that right they will realize those rights for themselves, right? So I think redoing sexuality or reworking sexuality by legitimizing formal equality of all genders is also reading economy in the sense of socio-economic transformation. I think state is a major player here. If state can invest in transgender health, education, their safety to begin with, there would be some stakes. If sex workers have a sense of dignity, if intersex people are able to decide their gender and sexuality, and if medical facilities are made friendly to the needs of intersex persons, if women can freely, again I will repeat, walk in the night without violence, if single women feel protected and safe, if effeminate men are not bullied in the school, if HIV/AIDS people are entitled for proper health care, I can say we are thinking and talking about sexual citizenship in India. During the recent lockdowns, one might come across visuals where poor working class women who just delivered baby had no food to eat. She was not able to get enough milk in her bosom to feed the baby. This visual was coming out from Delhi itself. Many Adivasi women walking back home were having their menstrual period without sanitary napkins. And a toddler is trying to wake up a dead mother at Patna railway station, right? So what sexual citizenship can be imagined in India today? The affluent class in their luxurious apartments with access to dating apps are definitely able to assert a kind of sexual citizenship. What about the masses who are hungry and shelterless? But there is also a toxic technoculture where misogynistic trolls and cyberbullying continue. Sexual citizenship is a very distinct thing in India, in contemporary India. And the social movements and the state together have to work a lot to ensure sexual citizenship in India. That would be my answer.
In this context, again, my question to you would be, on the relationship between between neoliberalism and extension of queer freedom. So, what according to you are the contradictory processes that a neoliberal state engages with?
Okay, I would quote here Wendy Brown, and Wendy Brown has been talking about neoliberalism. So, as Wendy Brown argues in Undoing the Demos, that is the book she wrote, that neoliberal rationality disseminates the model of market to all domains. Each and every domain of life is marketized. Somebody has talked about, I think Cynthia Cockburn has talked about the digitization of the whole body. And the whole body is also targeted by the market, the female body particularly. So you have artificial nails also if you want to go party, right? Go for party and all. You can wear artificial eyebrows, artificial nails, or whatever. So every aspect and every domains of life is marketized. I think a hegemonic queer freedom orchestrates through consumer aspirations, and sexuality is realized through culture of consumption. Sometimes this is also called Disneyfication of democracy. Democracy is Disneyfied, which is the right to buy, sell, even pleasure can be bought, right? The right to buy, sell, and purchase a range of sexual services and products, including the sex tourism. And certain sites in the global map you will find they are becoming the sites of LGBTQ tourism. But the LGBTQ tourism is only a nomenclature. Actually, it is titillating the desire of very affluent gay men. It is this constituency of, okay, so, so they can sell, purchase a range of sexual services and sex tourism. What the affluent class of queer need is credit card, disposable income, and an inviting home. This is what Lisa Duggan talks about. She's an American scholar, and she talks about these three things: credit card, disposable income, and inviting home. This constituencies of queer is depoliticized and demobilized. She uses these terms: depoliticized constituency and demobilized constituency. They don't have to do with politics because they're happy with buying, selling, and enjoying pleasure through their money. If this is queer freedom, then why in the same United States of America, this year in 2020, 16 transgender persons have been killed in United States of America, either by police or by friend or by anyone. And every year there is a history of transgender murder. And within this history of transgender murder, you will find that the Black transgender women, female trans feminine identity who are Black, they are the worst victim of this killing and murder. So, so I'm asking, is this a queer freedom? Why Indian state is unable to provide what is promised to trans communities in Nalsa judgment, right? Because democracy itself is marketized, right? Wendy Brown is saying. So is there any benefit out of extending certain socioeconomic entitlements to transgender people or not? And when the state is shrinking its responsibilities, right? State is retreating from many sectors. You see what is the percentage of expenditure on health, and why there is such a precarious situation when the corona times, right? There is what we lack is hospital beds, what we lack is ventilator, what we lack is ICU in the capital cities. So what about the small towns, and what about rural areas? And why this is so? Because the neoliberal state is not ready to spend more on public health. It will go for privatization of public. So in private hospitals, you have more and more resources, better doctors, better bed, ventilator, everything. That is also becoming problem in these time, corona times. But the public health system is very, very pathetic. The scenario is very, very pathetic, though they are trying to improve a little bit. So investing in transgender socioeconomic entitlements in a neoliberal state will be very difficult. So how the queer citizen will express itself? It will express itself with pro-consumerism, those queer who are very, very affluent. Neoliberalism responsibilizes individuals to help themselves, like it expects private university to generate its own resources. So the public will suffer under neoliberalism. And when public will suffer means the state is not ready to spend on public health, public education, and all those things through which public will be benefited. So the neoliberal states now they're asking the university to generate their own resources and fund for themselves. And you will see that funds are being cut on higher education. This is the face of neoliberalization, one of the facets of neoliberalization. The neoliberal state might give formal freedom. So how it will ensure queer freedom? It will give formal freedom. So 377 is read down, NALSA judgment has come, legitimizing transgender identities, but will fail to work towards substantive democracy, which comes through instituting socio-economic entitlements to marginal groups and not mere extension of civil rights to vote and buy property. So this is the dilemma of a neoliberal state, and neoliberal state is caught into, and the queer freedom is caught in this neoliberal aspirations, in this neoliberal, cutting of funds on public expenditure. So as I have said earlier, the state need not only redo sexuality or re-script sexuality by extending rights to certain sexualities and genders, but also redo the economy to make socio-cultural entitlements possible, which is not happening in neoliberal times. So these are the contradictory processes. You extend rights to people, but you do not ensure mechanisms for socio-economic entitlement. So what will happen? What is the fate of this hijra sex worker and trans women sex workers? What is the face of intersex people who are very, very poor? What is the fate of working class lesbian women and working class queer population, etc.? So unless and until some socio-economic entitlement comes, so how a working class individual, a working class queer will be free from the community? Only this person has more socio-economic entitlement. And neoliberal state, when it is reducing funding on public expenditure, right? How it will ensure socioeconomic entitlement along with sexual entitlements or sexual citizenship. So this is the dilemma of neoliberal state, I would say. Thank you.
So, Pushpesh, we were talking about consumerism and, sexuality. So, do you think there's a relationship between the study of popular culture and sexuality? I mean, if the former helps in forming ideas of sexuality.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yes, I do think, and I do wish to underscore that mass media in modern times, in modern society, shapes sociality and sexuality as well, and subject formation. I quote here Purnima Mankekar, and are active agents in scripting gender and sexuality. Mass media can script gender and sexuality. Raymond Williams also suggests that it is fallacious to conceive television technology distinct from social life. They are so important. Television today is, mass media today is very, very important. Highlighting the paradoxes constituting the politics of mass media, Patricia Oberoi writes, and I quote Patricia Oberoi here: while the mass media embody and reproduce society's dominant ideologies of class, race, gender, they may also paradoxically serve as a means of escape from even resistance to these ideologies and valorization, or as a space of intense struggle of resistance and conformity at once. Similarly, if you look at Maitri Chaudhary 2016 article on media and globalization and gender, you will see that she also demonstrates that the adroit use of feminism and chauvinism. So, market research and communication and media is using both feminism, selectively and eclectically appropriating feminism, but they're also using chauvinism, about Indian nation, great nation, and all that, which are contradictory by the wide network of market and communication research agency that form part of post-liberalized India's popular culture. These paradoxes and repackaging of ideologies such as feminism through mass media and popular culture also mediate the trajectory of gender and sexual freedom in contemporary India. For example, Bollywood has normalized screen kissing. So kissing was not allowed, right? So I don't know the exact year when the first Bollywood screen kissing was allowed, but it has been allowed. And now it is very, very spectacular on Bollywood cinema, which is a good thing. A formerly tabooed subject in Indian cinema, while also but the same Bollywood is also perpetuating misogyny and toxic masculinity. So youth are taking messages from both. There is sexual freedom, there is also certain uh, contestation of the stereotypes. There is also certain resistance coming up from mass media, but at the same time mass media is reinstituting and reinforcing misogyny and toxic masculinity. And you can see this box office success of Kabir Singh.
Mm, right.
Its director, I forgot his name, some Vanga, Sandeep Reddy Vanga or somebody, who says that if you don't hit a woman, if you don't kiss her whenever you want, if you don't, or some other things he's saying, then there's no emotion. So hitting a woman is also like part of your emotion. So how you are legitimizing misogyny, how you are legitimizing toxic masculinity, etc., etc., and it is open. So the youth are taking messages from both, right? So I'm saying popular culture does have a role to play, but it's a mixed baggage, right? It can reinforce sex role stereotypes, sexual violence, misogyny, but it can also question and challenge, and it can also do both, as Patricia is saying. And this is what we are caught up
So,
with. Yeah,
Pushpesh, our final question for you would be that you
yeah,
talk about othering, especially about men who study sexuality in academia. You talk about this othering. So, can you tell us a little more about it?
sure, sure. And I think I can speak through my own experiences of teaching sexuality. People in academia are by now used to gender perspective. If you say gender perspective, it will not create much, tension or anything. But when you utter sexuality, it raises eyebrows, some giggles follows, and one knows what is discussed behind you if you are a man. And and elsewhere I have written that how men also eroticize feminists, right? So they think that women's issues should be talked about feminist. Sexuality should also be talked about the same feminist. They're feared and they're eroticized. But if you're a man, all these things happen. And you may be asked weird questions, even by those who project themselves as fierce critique of caste, class, race, and other kind of inequalities and discrimination. And I talk about many male colleagues. Uh, in my university as well as outside, I have been asked by certain professors about how do hijras have sex. This is the question people would ask me. What is their genitalia? Men would ask what is their genitalia. How gay people will have sex, and is it oral sex common among gay people? These are the questions I'm being asked. When the subject you deal with sounds strange to others around you, you also embody that strangeness in those perception. So you embody certain strangeness in the perception of those people who ask us questions. They think you are away from the norm in some or the other way and not one of them, right? And I remember here Jeremy Seabrook, a queer scholar and a prolific writer from Britain, who told me about the brotherhood. In academic spaces, you also have men come as brother. There is a brotherhood. So he was referring to homosocial bonding. There is a homosocial bonding even in every spaces, in corporate spaces, in academic spaces, in every spaces. So whatever differences between are there between the men, but they're also united through a common bond, which is a homosocial bond. So Jeremy Seabrook, I'm quoting, he said that this brotherhood or homosocial bonding would know whether you belong there or not. So the homosocial bond which unite men despite differences is not easily accepting you, and you are definitely isolated. This is my experience, and I'm talking from my experiences. But based on Judith Butler, I must say that being other in majoritarian perception and continuing to exist within that majoritarian space is also a subversive act. It's also a subversive act, and this subversion is creative, I must say. Hmm? There's nothing to fear about it. It's very creative. It obviously informs your pedagogy and your writings. And you can see in my writings, whatever I'm writing and whatever I've written, it is there. And I tried to discuss this aspect also in one of my articles, which I wrote, EPW, a special volume on men doing feminism in India. And I have discussed this issue at length. Thank you.
Okay. Pushpesh, thank you so much for giving us time amidst everything that's been happening. It was a lot of fun listening to you, and I hope our viewers, especially the young students of sociology, gender studies, and any other discipline, take up more and more studies of sexuality and actually, discover and unravel new vantage points to study the discipline. And we can only hope that we move away from the sort of othering that is happening or rather happens. Thank you so much once again for the lovely discussion.
Thank you so much for this invite, and it was lovely talking to you both. Thank you.
Thank you.